I'm recording. All right, thank you for joining me for the addenda class. Not addendums, but addenda. If you have a question, please stop me. We're going to run through these addenda pretty quickly. I just want you to know they're there. If you have any specific concerns or questions, stop me and we'll address them. But mainly, yes, please silence your phones. So we do want to make sure that we get through them all. And mainly, I want you to know if you need to do something, then there's an addendum for that, okay? And then if you need to dig deeper into filling out the addendum at a later date, because we did the top of the waves this time, then you can call me, right? So I am going to share my screen. Everybody good? All good? Okay. Share. This mouse is kind of weird. Okay. There comes the fire department. Okay. Can y'all see that all right? Thumbs up? All good? Okay. Okay. So we're going to start with the third-party financing addendum. I'll teach contracts next week, but more than likely, unless it's a cash offer, you're going to be using a third-party financing addendum. So the type of financing, would you turn off that light? This is making a glare. That would be awesome. Yeah. Yeah, turn off that. Okay. So all these types of financing, basically the blanks are about, we're going to look at the conventional financing. So if it is conventional financing, be sure and check the boxes. If there's going to be a first mortgage loan in the principal amount of, that is the mortgage amount. On the contract, you have A, B, and C. A is the down payment. B is the mortgage amount. You add those two up, and that is C, which is the sales price. And so this is the mortgage amount, okay? And then in how many years? Is it a 30-year loan? Is it a 15-year loan? You know, this is the reason that we need a pre-approval letter, because if you don't have an idea of what the buyer is doing and what they've arranged with their lender, then you're just making stuff up. And this document is to give the seller a reasonable idea of what the buyer's intentions are in regarding getting a loan for this house. So so you put the mortgage amount and how many years that they intend to finance the loan with an interest not to exceed, okay, not to exceed. If they've been quoted today 3.85, 875 or something like that, 2 weeks from now, it may have jumped up over 4. You know what I'm saying? So you know how the interest rates bounce around. That's why it says not to exceed. If you put 3.875 right there, then in 3 weeks, when you start to lock in the loan, if they can't get it at 3.875, there's another place in this document that gives them the opportunity to get out of this loan. So now you don't want to, I mean, it's not about capturing and trapping your person, but it is about making sure that we can, you know, have flexibility in this interest amount. So if your buyer's quoted 3.875, I put 4.25 because it's a not to exceed, right? For per annum, per year, for the first how many years? Likely they're getting like a 30-year loan, and this interest rate's gonna be in place for the full 30 years. A lot of times, sometimes, very adjustable rate mortgage. They'll get an interest rate for the first 3 years, and then it may adjust. We don't see that much anymore, but that's why it says that per annum for the first, then that would be like 3 years, you know, if it's going to adjust after that. But likely it's a 30-year note, and the interest rate's going to be in effect for the full 30 years. And then origination charges, as shown in the buyer's loan estimate for the loan not to exceed, again, it's a not to exceed. Those are generally 1.5% to 2%. So that would be, if you put 1.5%, you'd probably be good, okay? Second mortgage, that's if they're going to get like if they want to avoid PMI, and to avoid PMI, you have to put 20% down. So they could have a 10% first loan in a 10% second loan, or a 15-5 or something like that, which would give them their 20% and they could avoid the PMI. We don't see a lot of first and second liens anymore. That's something that we did in the past a lot. So don't worry about that if there's not a second lien. Same thing with Texas Veterans Loan. How much are they going to finance for a period in the total amount of how many years at the interest rate established by the Texas Veterans Land Board? You don't even have to fill in the blank there. FHA, it's usually, if it's a plain vanilla FHA, it's a 203B. 203B is in Baker, okay? That's a plain Jane FHA. There are rehab loans and some others that fall into other categories. If it's something other than a plain Jane FHA, then you need to talk to the lender about what section number to put in there, okay? So that needs to, don't leave that blank, all right? And then again, of a loan, not less than, which is the financing amount, amortized monthly for not less than how many years, 30 years or whatever, with the interest not to exceed, that's your 4 1/4 or whatever that is, for the first, say, 30 years of the loan, with the origination charges 1.5%, okay? VA financing, likely it's 100%. So on page 1 of the contract, the section A, down payment, will be 0. And then B will be the financing amount, which will be the same as C, which is the sales price, if it's 100% financing, okay? And so you would just fill in the blanks as normal. And again, as USDA, same general information. Reverse mortgage is a different animal. It's basically the same thing, but I'm telling you, if you've got somebody that wants to do a reverse mortgage, find someone who has done a lot of them. Don't get someone that's done a few. Oh, I think I can do that. I've done a few. Reverse mortgages are tough and they're complicated. And so you get someone that has done them a lot. If you need a name, I've got one, okay? That takes a specific skill set and knowledge base to do that. On number 2, approval of financing. This is the buyers is wanting approval for the financing described above, will be deemed to have been obtained when the buyer approval and property approval are obtained, okay? Time is of the essence. So you come down and you check check this box. This contract subject to the buyer obtaining buyer approval. In other words, he has to be approved for a loan, okay? If the buyer can't mute you if you're not doing anything, if you're not talking to me, if you would mute yourself. If buyer cannot obtain buyer approval, buyer may give written notice to the seller within a certain number of days. So people say, well, how many days is that? I don't know. You need to talk to the lender. So how much work has the lender done? How much paperwork has been provided to the lender? Did they pull credit and have a conversation? That's not an approval. Because the lender, if they're a W-2 employee, they're going to want to see paychecks, check stubs, bank statements, such as that. If they're salary plus commission, they want to see income tax returns. If they're self-employed, then there's a plethora of other stuff that they're going to want. So that lender needs to have gone pretty far down the road in order for him to be able to say, okay, once you identify property, I should be able to get this buyer approved within, say, 2 weeks, okay, or 3 weeks. That way you can put the number of days that's accurate. Now, when he says 2 weeks, he's talking about 10 working days. When we say 2 weeks, we're talking about 14 calendar days. So 14 would go in this blank, okay? So lenders don't normally work on weekends. They're working on business days. We're working on calendar days. So it's very important to stay engaged with that lender and see what's going If the buyer, for some reason, something comes up at the last minute, just pops up, or he loses his job or something like that, within that number of days, the contract will be able to terminate. The buyer will be able to terminate the contract and get their earnest money back. Okay. The importance of having enough days is that if the buyer, if you've got 21 days there, which some reason 21 seems to be the favorite number, but if you put 21 days there, and on day 25, the buyer finds out, the lender tells him that he can't get the loan, then he's not going to get his earnest money back. Okay, so that's how important making sure that lender has gone pretty far down the road in order to make sure he gets completely approved before those number of days run out. Does that make sense? Very, very important. All right, so going on to the next page. So if the buyer does not terminate the end of page 1, under that period of time, the contract shall no longer be subject to the buyer obtaining buyer approval for his loan. Okay? Buyer approval will be deemed to have obtained when the terms of the loan described above are available. That's what I was talking about a while ago. If you put 3.875 is a loan or an interest rate, and then it jumps up to 4.25, the terms of the loan have just become unavailable. So if you find that, the buyer finds that out within that number of days, he can terminate the loan on that basis. Okay. Or lender determines the buyer has satisfied all the lender requirements related to buyer's assets, income, and credit history. That's how he gets approved. Okay. Now to check B, you can only check this box or this box. You can't check both. Okay. So the only way you can check this box on page 2, the contract is not subject to buyer obtaining buyer approval. That is, if he can bring a check to the closing table to purchase that property. He may choose not to because money is so cheap, okay? But he may have some cash accounts, some investment accounts. He may have $350,000 sitting in an account that he can get to if he needs to for that house. But he may be choosing to get a loan because that cash account may be earning 6% and he's only paying 3.5% on the loan. You see what I'm saying? So he may make a business decision not to get a loan. But you can't check both. He does not have the right to terminate and get his earnest money back if for any reason. Okay, he is buying that house, right? Whether he gets a loan or whether he doesn't get a loan. If you check that box, he's buying that house. Okay. Questions about that? Now, A is about the person. A is about the buyer. B is about the property. The property has to be approved as well. The lender has to approve the property. The buyer can be approved for his loan. He may be golden, ready to go, but the property may not pass lender approval. And that's for reasons such as appraisal, maybe it's not insurable, maybe there's some lender required repairs that are needed and required by the lender. So if the property doesn't get approved at some point in time, it has nothing to do with that number of days in paragraph A. It can go right up until, look at this, not later than 3 days before closing. You see that? So the lender has to inform the buyer that the property does not meet underwriting requirements. And he's got to give him that information 3 days before closing. And if he does, then the buyer can terminate the contract by giving notice to the termination. And he's got to, read on ahead, he's got to provide a written document from the lender stating forth the reasons. And then if he does terminate based on this, the earnest money will be refunded. Okay. So if he does not terminate, if the property is approved and all that, then he cannot terminate and get his earnest money back. Okay. If he's been approved for the loan and the property's been approved. Now, at the last minute, he can change his mind. We've had that happen, but he's not going to get his earnest money back. Okay. So, okay. So going down, VA loan, paragraph 4 will apply. If it's conventional, this paragraph is not needed. But if it's FHA or VA, then what this paragraph says, what the first part of this paragraph is basically HUD, FHA, or VA wants to see an appraisal value of the property of not less than the sales price. Right here, the lender sets forth the appraised value of the property of not less than blank. That's the sales price. They want to see the sales price, not the mortgage amount, the sales price. Okay. If the contract price or cost exceeds the reasonable value of the property, the 3-day notice of termination does not apply to this paragraph. In other words, if it does not appraise right up until closing, the buyer can terminate and get their earnest money back. Okay, or it says in A, buyer shall have the privilege and option of proceeding with the consummation of the contract without regard to the appraised value. Now he's going to have to bring that extra money to the table if he and the seller can't negotiate the sales price. Okay, so the buyer and the seller can go back to negotiating. Just a second. If they can't agree, then the buyer can terminate.
Is there something that they have to fill out for that? Is there another addendum for that?
No.
It's just.
No.
Okay.
Now, if the appraisal comes in, you're going to have to probably provide an appraisal, the copy of the appraisal to the other agent to prove that the appraisal didn't come in. So if the buyer and the seller can't negotiate that sales price to the appraised value, the buyer can decide if it's a $300,000 house, he feels like he's getting a good deal. It appraised at 305.
Right.
You know,
okay.
The buyer can bring that extra money to the table in the form of a down payment.
Okay.
But the appraised values is what the finance is going to be determined on. Okay. Does that make that's a good question? Any questions about that? Okay. We spent a lot of time on that because that is a very important form. So we're going to scoot through. Now, addendum concerning right to terminate. I've tried to put these kind of in an order where sometimes they're used. This was provided so that it provided, we were having all those crazy multiple offers and all that kind of stuff. Agents were writing stuff into the contract that shouldn't have been, practicing law all over the place. So finally, TRAC provided this addendum for us to communicate, the buyer communicate to the seller their intentions. So now, take note. The transaction cannot involve FHA or VA financing. This is only for conventional financing because this paragraph over here says that HUD, FHA, and VA requires an appraisal at the sales price. This form cannot change that, okay? This form cannot change the third-party financing addendum's rights that they provide. It provides to the buyer. All right. So if you're a seller and you get a FHA offer, don't ask for one of these. Okay. If you're the listing agent, if you're the buyer's agent, don't offer one of these. If your buyer is getting FHA or VA financing. Okay. You can't take away that right that FHA or VA buyer has. Now, having said that, it says that twice. It says it up here and it says it right there. Okay. Waiver. That if you check number 1, that means no matter what, that buyer is buying that house. No matter what. He waives his right to terminate. If the property approval is not obtained because the opinion of value, then the lender and the buyer can work it out, but that buyer's either bringing more money to the table or the lender, they're reworking their loan, the way the loan's set up, but that buyer is buying that house, okay, regardless of the appraisal. Number two, clear on that? Okay, that's no, he doesn't have any options. So number two is a partial waiver. Similar to number one, the buyer does waive the right to terminate under paragraph 2B of the third-party financing addendum if the property approval is not obtained because the appraisal does not satisfy underwriting requirements and the opinion of value is X dollars or more. Okay, so that gives a threshold. Given that same scenario, maybe it was a $330,000 house. Okay, maybe it was a little overpriced. It was in that hot market. The sellers thought they could do it. It was multiple offers. This buyer provided this document, and he probably, maybe he made a $330,000 offer. And he said, and I will buy this house if it appraises for, I will pay $330,000 for this house, but I want the appraisal to it come in at least 320. I'll bring the extra 10. I'm fine with that. But I want it to at least appraise for 320. Okay? So that's their floor. So if the appraisal comes in at 320 or above, then the buyer is buying that house and they're bringing whatever money that's needed to the table. 330 is the sales price. If it appraises above 320, he's paying 330. If it appraises at 320, then he pays 320. Then he doesn't have to pay more than 320. If it appraises under, he will pay up to 320. Okay, so it has to be at 320 or above in order for him to pay the sales price. Okay, make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. This one, and that's generally, number two is generally when there's 20% or less being put down. Because if a buyer's putting 5, 10, 15, 20% down, that lender is going to want to see a sales price appraisal because they want to see an 80% loan to value at a minimum. Okay, 80% loan to value. Now, with number three, this is used, say it's a $330,000 house. The buyer is taking the equity from the house they just moved out of, and they're putting $100,000 down. Okay, so now the ratio is different because they're financing 230, right? So what the lender is looking for is an 80% loan to value of 230, not 330.
Yeah.
Okay. So what this says is that in addition to buyer's right to terminate under paragraph 2B of the third-party financing, the buyer can terminate. Wayne, mute yourself, sweetie. I'm gonna mute you. Buyer may terminate the contract within so many days after the effective date. So this is also putting a limit on how long you can drag this thing out. So and it may be you as a listing agent, the seller requires the buyer to get their appraisal in, order the appraisal immediately, so it doesn't drag it out to 3 days before closing, right? So maybe the listing agent and the seller require them to get it within the first 15 days. Okay, so they're going to have to order that appraisal quickly. And the appraisal value, according to the appraisal obtained by the buyer's lender, is less than X. And the buyer may terminate the contract within 15 days if the appraised value is less than, so that's another threshold, but it has to be less than. So less than, maybe going back to the 330 sales price, if it's less than 320, then the buyer can terminate. Same threshold, but see, it's not a lender requirement. Up here, it's a lender's underwriting requirement. Okay. Here, it's an agreement between the buyer and the seller, because the lender doesn't care whether it appraises for 320 or not. Does that make sense? And the buyer delivers a copy of the appraisal to the seller. Okay. All right. So if that comes up, let me know and we'll go past it. Amendment. You use this once the contract is terminated, or once the contract is executed, you don't touch it again. You don't make any more changes to it, nothing. Once it's executed, it is a static document. If anything needs to be changed, you use an amendment. Okay. You can change the sales price. You can change the down payment. You can change the financing amount. You can change, all of the elements of the sales price combination. Number 2 is regarding repairs and treatments. After the inspection, if you represent the buyer, you're going to go over the inspection report with your buyer, determine what you're asking for. This is where you put it in this blank. If it doesn't fit in this blank, then you can add a sheet and call it an attachment. And then you would put C attachment in this blank. And then your second page would be attachment for repairs. And that would be your list of attachment. Put the signature blocks in there for the buyers and the sellers on the attachment as well. And now you've got a 2-page amendment regarding repairs. Make sense? And then number 3, date in paragraph 9 of the contract. What is that? It's the contract date. It's the closing date. Okay. So if you need to change the closing date, then you use the amendment and you use number 3 to change the closing date. Okay. So if you're screaming up on the closing day, maybe closing is Friday, and we've got one that the seller, I'm working with an agent, and the seller has not made all the repairs. So he's dragging his feet on the repairs. And so he said, what do I do? I said, you don't close. You don't close if the seller hasn't completed the repairs. If the seller hasn't completed the repairs, then the seller is in default, okay, according to the contract. So, but if you want to go ahead and give him some extra time to complete the repairs because the buyer still wants to buy the house, then change the closing date. So he'll be presenting to the listing agent an amendment to change this closing date. And then I told him to put a comment down here in other modifications to give the seller sufficient time to complete the repairs, because you want to state it out loud on the amendment why you're changing the closing date. Okay. The amount in paragraph 12A1B, let's go back to that. If the closing date passes, somebody's in default if you don't change the date. Determining who's in default is determining who held up closing. Okay, is the buyer not able to get fully, clear to close? Then it's the buyer's fault. The buyer's in default. Did the seller not complete his repairs? Then the seller's in default. Is there something on the title that the cloud on the title that title company is having a hard time clearing? That's a seller issue. Okay, so somebody's in default. So you have to determine who's in default when that happens. But the best thing to do is, if it can be fixed, go ahead, if it's going to take another week or another 3 days or whatever, and both parties, the seller still wants to sell, the buyer still wants to buy, then just change the closing date and try to get things pulled together. In paragraph 12A1B of the contract is changed to, I hate that, it keeps popping up. That is if the seller is contributing to the buyer's closing costs. Okay, so if in the contract the buyer asked for $1,000 in paragraph 12A1B, okay, so $1,000 is in paragraph 12A1B, and the buyer and the seller agree that the contract's been executed. Then when they negotiate repairs, the seller agrees to give the buyer $2,000 to take care of the repairs after closing. So the only way that the seller can give the buyer money is to contribute to their closing costs. So what you're going to do in that scenario is to change this, the amount in paragraph 12A1B of the contract is changed to, what would that be changed to? What would that be changed to? You've got $1,000 on the contract already, and the seller is contributing $2,000 toward repairs.
How much of what?
Good.
3,000. 3,000, because you don't want to give away the 1,000 that they've already agreed to. They're adding 2,000 to it for the repairs.
So all things will go back to the buyer.
Exactly.
Okay.
So the buyer's already negotiated 1,000. Now they've negotiated 2,000 more for the repairs. So that number is 3,000. The contract is changed to 3,000. If you put 2, the buyer just lost $1,000. Okay? The buyer just lost $1,000. So if you do that, do not put anywhere on this amendment that it's in lieu of repairs.
Right.
Okay? Don't put it on there, because the lender, they freak out when they see things like that. And as a husband that was a lender, he doesn't want to see that. He doesn't need to know, because generally it's penny ante stuff. It's nickel dime stuff if it's $2,000. Maybe there's a fog window here, HVAC service there. It's nothing that should concern the lender. So, but if you put anything on here that it's in lieu of repairs, that underwriter may focus on that and start getting into your business. So just put the $3,000 seller contribution, send it to everybody signs it, send it to the lender and the title company, and everything's good, okay? Because that $3,000 has to be on the closing disclosure.
What is the amount that the contribution towards closing is like large amount, say 10 or something?
Good question. So what Lawrence was saying, what about the buyer had already agreed, or sometimes it's a builder. Maybe the builder, you wouldn't be using an amendment, but the builder decides to contribute like $12,000 to the buyer's closing costs or something. Or maybe the seller knows, they've overpriced, they know it needs repair, so they contribute a bunch of money to the closing costs. And then you negotiate some more money. Well, the lender's going to have a limit to what the seller can contribute to the buyer. And you need to find out what that limit is. On FHA, sometimes it can go up to 6%. Conventional, sometimes they cap it at 3%. But you need to know what your threshold is, because it's based on what the lender will allow. If the seller has maxed out what the lender will allow, then you can't negotiate more. Something's going to have to be done. Then you kick in your negotiating skills, which I think Chip's going to teach on Monday. So tune in for that. But there is a threshold. There's a limit to what the lender will allow. Great question. Thank you, Lawrence, for bringing that up. So if there's lender required repairs and treatments, then the cost of those repairs and treatments, maybe it's a new roof and the seller does not have the deductible. Maybe it's a hardship situation. They don't have the money. They don't have the money. It could be 1% of the value of the home. It could be $3,000, $10,000. They don't have the money. And so the buyer can share in that expense, or they can either share it or the buyer can pay for it. And this is where you say that, okay? Cost of lender required repairs and treatments is itemized on the attached list, and it will be, whatever the is or whatever the, this is a lender required repairs and treatments will be paid as follows. So much will be paid by the seller, so much will be paid by the buyer. It may say zero by the, zero by the seller, and then the buyer absorbs all of it. Excuse me. All right. Number 6, buyers paid the seller an additional option fee of X amount for an extension of the unrestricted right to terminate. I see 0 in this a lot. Trek and TAR have a concern about that. This comes up regularly because in the contract, you can't have an option period without paying a fee, okay? It says there must be an option fee paid in order to have the unrestricted right to terminate the contract. This says buyer has paid additional option fee, past tense, not will pay, has paid. So be careful with that. I've seen 0. It's a slippery slope. If you go to court, it may not hold up. If you put $1, that's not considered much or enough, but you better pay that $1. You better pay the $1 or you don't have the unrestricted right to terminate. Just like in the contract, if you don't pay that option fee, you can put it in the contract. And if you don't pay it, the buyer doesn't have the unrestricted right to terminate if he never paid the fee. Okay, so just take that in consideration.
So the buyer has to pay it first before they sign.
I think that the fee goes with the amendment.
Oh,
Okay.
okay.
The fee should be paid with the, sent with the amendment. And you can do Venmo, you can do Zelle or whatever you need to do, it's so that you can prove that it was done. But I think it needs to go with the amendment because it's past tense. Okay. And then it's on or before 5 p.m. on a date. That's a date. Okay. It's a hard date. And then whether it will or will not be credited to its sales price. Now, number 7, waives the unrestricted right to terminate the contract for which the option fee was paid. If you, as a buyer's agent, negotiate a 10-day option period, I urge you to get that property inspected as quickly as possible. I know there's a lot. They're busy, so have several inspectors in your pocket that you can contact to try to get that property inspected as quickly as possible. And then when you get that done, get that amendment for the repairs, that request for repairs over to the listing agent as quickly as possible so that they can have time to think about it, get estimates, whatever. And then when they agree, when the buyer and seller agree, if you've checked 7 on the amendment and everybody agrees, then on that executed day, your option period ends. Okay. So if you got a 10-day option period, you get it inspected on day 2, you present the amendment on day 3, which the seller will love you, the listing agent will love you if you do that. That gives the seller a day or 2 to think about it. So maybe you agree on day 4 or 5, then your option period is over. You don't have 5 days floating out there for the buyer to wake up and change their mind. Okay. So this is an advantage to the listing agent and the seller. So this would be a very good thing for a buyer's agent to offer because that will help them come to an agreement quickly. If you wait till day 6 or day 7 to present the amendment, or day 8 or 9 in a 10-day option period to present the amendment, you've already irritated them. You've already ticked them off, because you waited till the last minute. So they're going to be less agreeable, in my opinion, in my experience. So just give that some thought and get on with it. The date for buyer to give written notice to the seller that he can't obtain buyer approval is, as set forth in the third-party financing addendum, is changed to. So this is third-party financing, that 15 days, 21 days, whatever that number of days. If you're screaming up on that number of days, and the lender says, man, I'm waiting on this one final statement, or I'm waiting on this one final thing from the VA saying everything's good, you may need a few more days, okay? This is where you change, where you add to that number of days, okay? So, and that's a hard date. That's a date, okay? Other modifications, this is used just for factual statements. Maybe you're taking a name off the contract. Maybe you're adding a name to the contract. Maybe you're correcting a misspelling. Maybe you're asking the seller to have the property professionally cleaned prior to turning over possession. You're telling the title company that the seller and the buyer have agreed to split the title policy, the cost of the title policy. It's things like that, okay? You can't change any benefits or elements of the contract, but you can, it's just information. So if you need to say something and nothing applies, let me know and we'll figure it out, okay? And then be sure and execute this form. I see, and I know Christy probably sees these come through with no date on them. If there is a date required, you've got to put a date on it, okay? All right, we're going to start scooting here. Non-realty item, if they're leaving a refrigerator, put the refrigerator, okay? If they're asking for the pool table upstairs, put the pool table upstairs. If you've negotiated any kind of non-realty item between the buyer and the seller, put it in writing. I can't tell you how many times I have had agent call me and go, okay, I represent the buyer. We did a final walkthrough and then we've taken possession 2 days later and the refrigerator's gone. And the agent said they were going to leave it. I said, well, did you put it on non-realty items addendum? No. Well, then you have nothing in writing to be able to enforce. So you've got to put it in writing, okay? You've got to put it in writing or you can't, it's not enforceable. Okay. Now there's no warranties. Got to understand that. Seller temporary lease. Okay. So closing day is Friday or Thursday. Let's say Thursday because we don't like Friday closing days. Closing day is Thursday. Seller needs a couple more days to get the movers to come on Friday, load them up, and Saturday they'll be completely gone, but they want Saturday to be able to clean. So they're going to turn the property over to the buyer at 5 o'clock on Saturday, okay? So this is what you would do, even if it's a few hours, because it's so important to be clear about that, and just in case something happens to the property. A hailstorm comes through, somebody, blows something up in the kitchen, or there's a chimney fire or something like that. Who's going to pay for it? Okay, whose insurance is going to be responsible? If you don't have a lease, then it's unclear. So these are really important, even if it's very, very short. Parties to the lease: the landlord is the buyer, the seller becomes the tenant. And of course that's the property address. It commences on the date the sales covered by the contract is closed. So upon closing and funding, it is now the buyer's house. The house belongs to the buyer and the seller is now the tenant, right? And it terminates, you can put a date or you can put 3 days after closing, just in case the closing date moves, okay? Yes, ma'am.
So for that, the new buyer would still have to have the homeowner's insurance.
Yes.
And then it would automatically be like they were a tenant.
Yes,
How you just explained. Okay.
and he would need to let his insurance company know, hey, the seller has a 3-day lease back. Oh, okay, good. He needs to have the knowledge of that.
Oh, but they wouldn't have to carry like renter's insurance or anything like that.
Well, it really depends on the limit. That's the insurance company's decision.
Okay.
If it's the great question. So seller's temporary lease is, how long is it good for? Up here.
90.
No more than 90 days. Okay. So if you got a 65-day lease, the insurance company may want to put renter's insurance, like a landlord insurance,
Okay.
rather than full coverage.
Okay.
And then the seller, as the tenant, would need to carry full, coverage as well.
Okay.
So the seller doesn't terminate their insurance. The buyer goes ahead and gets their insurance turned on, and so you've got plenty of insurance coverage in the event something happens. And then the tenant shall pay the landlord as rental so much per day. It depends on the per diem. If it's just a couple of days, sometimes it's zero. In a real serious buyer's market, I've seen 30 days for zero. We're not in that market anymore. So if it's more than a few days, then I would think it's the per diem, whatever they're, whatever it's costing the buyers, for their principal and interest, taxes and insurance. It's usually $30 to $50 a day. In the deposit, I think even if you give them a zero per day rent, it's good to get a deposit, because there may be something that's, if the house is full of furniture the last time you saw it, they may, when you move all the furniture out, there may be a stain on the carpet. The movers may, gouge a wall, getting the furniture out of the house or stuff like that. It's good to collect $250, $500, and you can tell the seller, hey, I'm gonna hold the check, okay? And if everything's good after you turn over possession, I'll just hand the check back to you. But if it's not, then you still have to watch this. The unused portion, if the landlord has to use any, the landlord shall refund the unused portion of the deposit with an itemized list of all deductions from the deposit. The landlord is obligated, the seller or the tenant, landlord, who is now the buyer, is obligated to give the seller, who's the tenant, a itemized list of deductions of the deposit within 30 days. Okay, so be careful with that. Make sure that happens. Just like in a regular lease. Tenant shall pay all utility charges. Generally, that's the case. They just pay, tenant keeps their utilities on until they move out, and buyers, they switch, and, meters read, and no harm, no foul. Use of property, pets, that's, if there's allowed pets, if there's not pets. If they already have a pet, usually it says the pets that are now present, or, pets currently in the home, or whatever. You can't make the seller get rid of their pets for 3 days, right? So condition of property, they're assuming the state of repair and commencement of the lease, should be set for normal wear and tear. Special provisions, let me know if there's anything weird. Or this could be a place where you put seller will have the house professionally clean upon move out. You can put it in the lease if you want to. And be specific. Professional, is that including the carpet, not including the carpet? You need to be careful. I've had questions about that. Professionally cleaned, they didn't get a carpet clean, but that's what the buyer wanted. Well, they didn't say that, so if you want the carpet clean, you need to make sure they, including the carpet, say that out loud. Repairs and maintenance, indemnity, insurance, landlord tenant shall each maintain insurance on the contents, consult your insurance agent, all that stuff. Default, termination, holding over. If the tenant decides that he doesn't want to move out after that, or something happens and he wants to hang in there for a couple more days, make this sting, okay? I usually put $150. If he wants to stay, it's going to cost him $150 a day. So you want them out, because the buyers probably arrange their movers and all that kind of stuff as well. Okay. All right. And landlord, tenant signs everything, all that jazz. All right. Subject to mandatory membership in a property owners association, not for use with condominiums, because this language is in the contract, condominium contract. But if there's an HOA, you give the name of the property owners association and the phone number. It should be, this is the buyer's agent fills this out when they're making an offer. It should be on the seller's disclosure on the last page if they fill that out correctly, because that's where the information is asked for. Subdivision information. Subdivision information contains 3 things: the restrictions, the bylaws and rules, and the resale certificate. The restrictions, the bylaws and rules, and the resale certificate. That's what it's called. That's what it's talking about when it's called subdivision information. If you check number 1, which is generally what happens, within so many days after the effective date of the contract, seller shall obtain, pay for, and deliver the subdivision information, okay? And then when the subdivision information is delivered to the buyer has 3 days after they receive the information to terminate and get their earnest money back. So if they see something on the HOA documents that they don't like, maybe they wanted to do something that raise chickens in the backyard, and then they find out they can't raise chickens in the backyard because the HOA won't allow it, then they've got 3 days to terminate and get their earnest money back, okay? And number 2 is the same way, but the buyers are going to pay for it, okay? So going up here, the number of days should be at least 14 or 15, because by law, HOAs have 10 business days to deliver the subdivision information. That 10 business days equals 14 calendar days. So I would put at least 14, 15 days. It's usually the big property management companies, everything's done online, all that kind of stuff. You don't have any problems with that. They can deliver it just that fast. But if you've got one of these self-managed property owners associations or something like that, then that sometimes that causes, that creates some delay, okay? 3, buyer has received and approved the subdivision information before signing the contract. So the seller was smart enough to go ahead and order the subdivision information, or perhaps they had already ordered it for another buyer who backed out, or whatever the case may be. So this says the buyer does or does not require an updated resale certificate. Generally, the resale certificates are good for 60 to 90 days. Okay, and it says it on the resale certificate that this information is good for 60 days, or this information is good for 90 days. So if it's well within that time, then the buyer may not require an update, okay, which is fine. But I would caution a seller, unless it is a hot property and you think it's going to just go, sell very quickly, because if you go ahead and order and get delivered the subdivision information, so if you have it ready to give to the buyer right away, like during the option period, what if you sit on the market for 65 or 70 or 80 days? Then you've got to update that information. So you kind of have to, it's kind of a crapshoot. You have to be careful with that. If the number 4 is the buyer does not require delivery of the subdivision information. Maybe they're buying a lease property and they already have one in the same area, or they live in the area or something like that, then the buyer may not require it, but I guarantee the title company is going to want a resale certificate, okay? So down here, let's jump to E, authorization. Seller authorizes the association to release this information to the buyer and the title company. If the buyer does not require the subdivision information or an updated resale certificate, I'm reading down here, can't get this cursor to be where I want it to, and the title company does require the information, and they will, then somebody's going to have to pay for it, okay? So who's going to pay for it? And the only reason that you would check a box here is if number 4 is checked, okay? So if the buyer doesn't require delivery and the title company does, then who's going to pay for it? Then it's either the buyer or the seller, okay? So going back up to material changes. If anything changes in the subdivision information between the time the information is delivered and closing, the seller has to disclose that. And a lot of times at the end of the year, they'll order the subdivision information, say in September, and then in October, maybe it's due to close at the end of October. In October, the seller gets a letter notifying him that the HOA dues are going up for the next year. That's material change that would be substantial. So that information has to be disclosed to the buyer, okay? if anything, if any of the subject information provided was not true, or the material adverse change in subdivision information occurs prior to closing, if the buyer wants to terminate, they can and get their earnest money back. Okay. So a situation came up a couple of years ago. It was a condo complex, and there was a pool in the area, and it needed some maintenance. And so I think it was like in February or something like that, that the sale took place. And the HOA had it shut down, and the pool shut down, and it had been shut down the year before. I don't think they had the money to do the repairs that were needed. And so when the buyer found out that the HOA was not going to repair the pool, then she backed out. She terminated and got her earnest money back because that was important to her. Okay. So but that was a material change in the subdivision information, because that question was specifically asked. The seller went to the HOA and said, what are you going to do about this? We're not going to do anything. Would you put that in writing? And he gave that to the buyer. The buyer said, this is a material change, adverse action. I'm out. Give me my earnest money back, because the pool was important to her.
But even though they signed this form?
Yep. That's the adverse change.
Oh.
The adverse change. Because when you buy in a subdivision that has a pool, you assume that you're going to have access to the pool. And the subdivision information probably talks about access to the pool and pool rules and things like that. But the adverse change was the repairs were not going to be made and the pool was not going to be open. So that was her problem. So in fees, except as provided by paragraphs A, D, and E, which means A is, A specifically says who's going to pay for the subdivision, seller, buyer, or not at all. The buyer shall pay any and all associated fees or other charges associated with the transfer of the property. The transfer, there's sometimes a fee just for paperwork. I think it's just another way that the HOA makes some money. It's not a part of the subdivision information. Who pays for the subdivision information is taken care of in paragraph A, right? A, D, and E. But if there's a transfer, then the buyer can pay part of that in the amount not to exceed. Sometimes you see $0, sometimes you see $100, sometimes you see $150, just whatever the buyer decides they want to do, okay? Okay, so and sometimes, in D, there are some reserves that are required by the buyer to be paid into the reserve account of the association, and that is a buyer cost. And so make sure you check the CD and make sure the deposits for reserves are charged to the buyer, not the seller. Okay. All right. Ooh, yeah, hurry up. Okay. Lead-based paint, 1978, built before, uses form, not rocket science, but make sure you have this filled out. Mr. Listing Agent, the seller fills out B, and then the buyer has to acknowledge in paragraph C and D, okay? I know Christy and I know I kick back a bunch of these. We'd have all these wonderful, all the signatures and everything in place, but nothing checked or half the stuff checked. This is a serious document. And let me tell you what, if this is an EPA, if the EPA comes and audits us, the fines are hefty, okay? So that's why we're Nazis about all of this being filled out, okay? That's why, there you go. And it's talking about, when you talk about copies of the pamphlet, it's not a pamphlet, it's a book, but it's Protect Your Family from Lead in Your Home. Here it is. And it's long, okay? So just don't print it, email it to them. It's in TREC and Texas Realtor documents, TXR documents. Oh my gosh. I probably should, there we go. Okay, so it's long. So just send it to them. If you represent the buyer, send it to them, okay? For sale of other property by buyer, if the buyer has to sell their property in order to buy another property, because they need the proceeds, this is the form you use. It's contingent, this contract is contingent upon the buyer's receipt of the proceeds from the sale of the buyer's property at, that's the house that they have to sell, on or before. Hopefully that's the closing date if they're already under contract. If they're not under contract, then you have to guess at it, okay? But here's the tricky part. If the contingency is not waived or satisfied by the above date, the contract will terminate automatically, okay? So if the buyer's property does not close on or before May 31st, the contract is terminated. Now you have to do some paperwork to get everything done, but so the title company will be refund the earnest money. But so don't let this date pass you by. And this is one of those things that you can put in other modifications. So maybe you've guessed that the buyer's house will be closing May 31st, or maybe that is the contract close date and their buyer needs some more time. Well, if you change the closing date of the contract, you better change the closing date on this form. And what you would put in other modifications is on the addendum for sale of other property by buyer, the date in paragraph A is changed to, and then you put the new closing date. Okay, so don't let those dates, this is serious stuff. Okay. All right. If the seller accepts a written, now if the seller accepts this with a contingency on the buyer's property selling, he can go, it goes into AK status, active kickout. This is the kickout clause. B is the kickout clause. So the seller can, the property can continue to be shown, okay? And if the seller accepts an offer to sell the property by somebody else, the seller has to notify the buyer, and there's a form for that they've accepted another offer, and that the buyer needs to waive the contingency on or before a certain number of days. Usually it's 2 or 3 days. And so you use the notice to send to the buyer and say, okay, we've accepted another offer. That means an offer has been accepted as a backup offer. It's been executed, okay? So listing agent, execute that offer. Because if you don't have an executed offer and you give this buyer notice and they don't want to move forward, then you don't have any offers. And then you're back to square one, and your seller is not going to be happy with you. Besides, that's what the form says. So the buyer must waive the contingency on or before 2 or 3 days after the seller's notice. If they can't, they just can't say, we don't have an offer on our house, or I'm not sure about this buyer, whatever, then the buyer can't waive the contingency. And the contract will terminate, the buyer gets his earnest money back, okay? If the buyer decides to waive the contingency, they notify the seller on the same form, and they can deposit, the listing agent, the seller may ask for an additional deposit of earnest money, okay? All notices and waivers must be in writing and are effective when delivered in accordance with the contract. So be sure and use the proper forms. Now, if in the instance where a buyer may waive the contingency, maybe their contract is they've been executed, the buyer's gone through their option period, they're 2 weeks from closing, everything looks good, maybe they have a clear to close. It's a risk. Something still could happen at the last minute, but the buyer is willing to take that risk and waive their contingency, okay? Now, in D, if they waive the contingency and fail to close and fund because the buyer's non-receipt of the proceeds, and the buyer, their buyer does fall in at the last minute, the buyer will be in default, and then seller can exercise remedies in paragraph 15 of the contract, which means he can sue him or he can terminate and get the earnest money, buyer's earnest money, okay? If the buyer waived the contingency and then can't close. Got that? Okay. Come on, addendum, back up. We mentioned backup a while ago. This is if your seller has already executed a contract with a buyer. And maybe he's got a hot property, you got multiple offers, and one of the offers says, would you accept a backup? And you go to your seller and say, would you want a backup? And explain it to him, okay? So the backup contract, you negotiate it just like you would a normal contract. They can go back and forth on any of the terms. You come to an agreement with this form attached to the contract. The earnest money and the option fee must be paid right up front. But this contract the backup contract is contingent upon the termination of the first contract dated X. Okay, what date was the first contract executed? You can find that on the MLS down at the very bottom of the listing of the MLS sheet. This is contract date for the sale of the property, okay? So the earnest money and the option fee. I talked to Dawn Moore, who was on the broker lawyer committee, and she recommended and she's provided language to such. And what I recommend is if it's a $300,000 house, don't tie up $3,000 of the buyer's money at the title company on a backup contract. There's 2 spaces in the earnest money paragraph to deposit 2 different amounts of earnest money. So on the first earnest money, deposit $100, okay? And that's within 3 days of the execution of this backup contract. And then there's a second sentence that says a second amount in the earnest money in an amount of, and then that would be your $2,900 is paid within so many days after the contract. Go ahead and put 3 days in there because there's a blank there. And then what she's given me language that says that you put in special provisions, the second deposit is after the backup contract becomes primary, and that is the amended executed date, the amended effective date, okay? So you deposit your initial $100, and then if the backup contract becomes primary, then that's when your second earnest money deposit takes place. Make sense? Do the same thing for the option fee, because you're not getting the option fee back. You're not getting it back. You get the earnest money back. So don't blow $150, $250 on an option fee for a backup contract because it may never get there, okay? So $10, and then in special provisions say a second, option fee deposit in the amount of such and such will be paid when the backup becomes primary, okay? And so if you get into that situation, let me know. I'll email you that language, okay? And I think it's on our kwdfwonline.com. I'll have to go check. Got it? Okay. If the first contract doesn't terminate on or before, how long is your buyer willing to wait to see if that first contract's going to terminate? Do they want to go through just the option period, maybe a little further, to see where the financing goes through or not? Maybe all the way up to closing, okay? And you'll have to guess if it executes on May 15th, it may close on June 15th. You can guess, or a little bit further, but that's the date that your buyer wants to wait and see if they can become the backup. Make sense? All right. And in an amendment or modification of the first contract will not terminate the first contract. In other words, if they have to amend the closing day or something like that, that does not null and void the first contract. If they have to, the first contract has to be terminated. Now, the beauty of doing these for the listing agent, you automatically got a backup, okay? So if this first buyer falls out during the option period, can't get their loan, you don't have to go back on the market, deal with all the, open houses and not anymore. showings and all that kind of stuff, you can move that backup contract right up into first position and move on down the road, okay? The advantage to the buyer is they don't have to compete again for that property, okay? So I've seen listing agents play games and not execute a backup contract. You present it, but they never execute it. You don't have a backup contract unless that seller executes that contract, okay?
Can you put that on the listing, like taking backup offers?
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh.
You can put it on the MLS. You bet, you bet. You can say, particularly if well, it would be kick out if it was, depending on selling a home. But if there's a financing contingency and it doesn't go through, you just move a backup offer right up in there. So, okay.
So these on the beat, determining day on, say, whatever the hot day is, June 15th, and if it's passed, and then this backup offer would be terminated, right?
That's right.
And then the seller has to return whatever the amount
Or
they
earnest
pay
money.
for the earnest money.
Right. But you have to do the termination, you have to do the release of earnest money. It doesn't happen automatically.
Right.
Be clear about that. Because the title companies, that's their deal. They want their paperwork trail. They want their paper trail. They want to see the buyer termination, and they want to see the release of earnest money with the signatures on it. Okay. All right. Representation disclosure. If you have a listing, whether it's a lease listing or a sale listing, and you get an unrepresented buyer from Zillow or wherever, okay, off an open house, wherever that unrepresented buyer comes from, or unrepresented seller, you must disclose in writing who you represent. Actually, you can do verbally, but it's really good to put it in writing. Particularly if they want to buy your listing, okay? You don't have to be intermediary. And a lot of times your seller doesn't, because if you're intermediary, you have to step away and you can't give your seller that you're in a relationship with, you can't give him advice and you can't give that buyer advice. So that seller may not be happy with that situation. It depends on the buyer. And if that buyer, you can say, hey, I represent the seller. I can't represent you both. My seller doesn't really want me to do that. But I do, here's my notice to you in writing who I represent. Okay. And if the buyer says that's okay, I'm buying it for a rent property, or this is my 20th purchase, I get it. I really don't need representation. I've done this a bunch. I'm okay being 100%. Then I would put in, if they're okay with being unrepresented, I would put in, you check the box that you're representing the seller, and then I would put a statement right here: buyer agrees, or buyer wants to remain unrepresented. Buyer chooses to remain unrepresented. That it's his choice, right? And then he gets to sign down here, okay? Or they get to sign, whichever's case may be.
So you put down the statement underneath.
Yeah, in these lines right
Okay.
here, I would put buyer chooses to remain as unrepresented. And it's very common in a tenant situation. You represent the landlord, the tenant, calls you off Zillow or wherever, and they don't really need advice. It's not, it's not that kind of a transaction. You're just paperwork, you're just transactional at that point. So go ahead and get their acknowledgement that, send them that you're representing the landlord, and tenant chooses to remain unrepresented. Now, if you've had a conversation with that buyer and they're a first-time home buyer, they've moved in from another state, they really don't know how it works, maybe they haven't bought in 25 years. That's almost like being a brand new buyer, because market's different, everything's different, contracts are different, everything's changed in 25 years. Maybe that buyer truly does need representation. Then go get one of your buddies in the office to represent that buyer, okay? Don't let the dollar signs cloud your judgment, because it's a lot cheaper to, take half that commission than take the full commission and risk getting sued. Okay, because sometimes buyers need representation, and if you can't be helpful, you can't guide them, and if they feel like they're not being represented, if they feel like they're being slighted and that kind of stuff, then it can get ugly. Okay, so be very careful with that. Be very careful. Intermediary is when both parties are good, they're fine, they're done this before, this is my 20th house, don't need your advice anymore, I'm good. It's a rare occasion that intermediary with no appointments works.
So for this form, if the buyer doesn't want representation, so the to field is to the buyer's name.
You're saying
No,
who you
on the
represent?
on the top, to and from.
To the buyer from
You.
right? Or to the tenant from you. It's whoever you're representing. Okay. All right. Okay. Intermediary. Speaking of intermediary, generally we use this when there's appointments. We're a big enough office that a lot, quite a few times, quite often, one of our agents representing a buyer the buyer will want to purchase one of our listings. Remember, the listings in the listing agreement and the buyer representation agreement belong to the brokerage. Okay, so the broker's firm represents the owner and represents the buyer, right? So that creates intermediary right there. So you're letting the landlord or seller know, and the prospect, the buyer or the tenant, from the broker's firm, Keller Williams DFW Preferred, regarding the property and the date. Okay, so broker's firm represents the owner under a listing agreement. Okay, that's representation, and also the prospect under a buyer-tenant representation agreement. So in order to have intermediary, you have to have a listing agreement in place and a buyer rep agreement in place. Some of you people out there don't want to use buyer rep agreements. You use listing agreements. Not sure why you don't want to use buyer rep agreements, but some people choose not to. But in intermediary, you have to, because of this right here. The brokerage represents the owner and the prospect under written agreements. Okay, so and they have both owner and prospect previously authorized broker to act as intermediary. Remember, in your listing agreement and your rep agreement, there's a paragraph on that. Check intermediary approved or not approved. Okay, so if they check the approved box, then you can proceed. If they check the unapproved box, then you got to change that, or you can't. It's not going to work. Okay, but most of the times intermediaries checked, because that allows you to show that buyer in-house listings. Okay, and if they want to buy an in-house listing, then you've created intermediary. So the broker, that would be me, will act in accordance with authorized granting in the listing agreement and the buyer representation agreement. In other words, I can't give advice to either of you, the listing agent or the buyer's agent. If you get into an intermediary situation, maybe actually if you represent a buyer that wants to buy Shay's listing, I can't give you advice anymore. You're going to have to go get advice from somebody else, because I'm the intermediary, and as the broker I have to remain neutral. And you don't go talk to Shay. I mean, you don't talk to each other,
right? Because
you represent the buyer. So you get advice from somebody else, and Shay's good on her own. Okay. Now, down here in D, the broker will or will not appoint associates to communicate with each of the parties. In this particular example, Shay would represent the owner, and Ashley would represent the prospect. Okay, so that you can fully represent your buyer, Shay will fully represent her seller, and all of that, and everybody's good. Okay, and then everybody has to sign this form. Okay. Okay. Termination of contract. So if the buyer, for any of these reasons, wants to terminate, you have to, even if the form says that will automatically terminate, well, you still have to do the notice of buyer's termination, because everything has to be done in writing in the real estate world, right? So between the undersigned buyer and seller, buyer notifies the seller. Paragraph 23 of the contract, that's the option period. They can't get their buyer approval within third-party financing addendum. The property doesn't satisfy property approval. Maybe the appraisal didn't come in and you couldn't negotiate the price, or there was lender required repairs that the seller wasn't willing to do, whatever that is, that's about the property, okay? Buyer elects to terminate under the mandatory membership and owners association. They've been delivered the subdivision information, and within 3 days they've decided to terminate. Buyer elects to terminate 7B2 under the seller's disclosure notice. So if you deliver a disclosure notice after the contract is executed, you have what? Is it 3 days or 4 days? 3 or 4 days. Anyway, a few days, right? So the buyer can terminate the contract. If he gets the seller's disclosure and sees something on that seller's disclosure that he doesn't like, he can terminate. Addendum concerning the right to terminate due to lender's appraisal, that form that we talked about. And then paragraph 6D of the contract, that is the residential condominium, because timely objections weren't cured. In other words, or that's 6D is if you put, if the buyer wants to build a pool in the backyard, or build a 20 by 30 shop in the northeast corner or something like that, and then the survey comes in and shows that you can't do that because of easements or whatever, then the buyer has an opportunity to terminate, right? So that's 6D. That's 6D, okay? So that's, now, if there's any other, you have to have a specific paragraph number. If the buyers change their mind, they're not getting their earnest money back, okay? The seller, you can say that the seller is defaulted because they couldn't close, okay? So, or the seller didn't do the repairs. There's other reasons why the buyer could terminate, okay? If the seller's in default for some reason, okay? Or they can't clear something with the title work can't be cleared in a timely fashion. So there are other ways that a buyer can terminate other than what's listed. Release of earnest money. This has to accompany the buyer's termination, and there is a seller's termination form too. I don't think I put it in here. There has to be a release, because a title company will not cut checks without everybody's signature on this document. It's their paper trail, okay? So, and that both listing and buyer agents have to sign this form too. So, and everybody has to be in agreement. So sometimes if the buyer terminates rightly and the seller doesn't like it, and so the buyer's agent fills out this form, undersigned, direct the Republic Title to disperse the earnest money as follows: $3,000 to Mr. and Mrs. Buyer. The buyer signs it, the cooperating broker signs it, deliver it to the seller and the title company at the same time. And the seller's like, no, I'm not going to sign it. You left me hanging, blah, blah, blah. Okay. So there's remedies in the contract for that. And we'll talk about that next week when I talk about the contract. But just know that the title company likely will not release funds unless everybody signs this thing. Okay. So we have to go back to the drawing table, do some more negotiating, and get past it. Hydrostatic testing. Hate this. Hate it. So, concerning the property the buyer has to have permission from the seller in order to do hydrostatic plumbing tests. Okay, and there's a specific plumbing tests, not the high pressure gas lines or anything like that. These are specific to plumbing. and you have to get seller's authorization, and you have to come to an agreement on who's going to be liable for the damages. So the damages is what is concerning, because if there's a leak and the test discovers the leak, the seller is going to assume that the buyer caused the leak. Well, maybe not. And I'm not sure who's going to determine, was the leak there or did the test create the leak? So likely the test does not create the leak. And I have a video for that I've shown before when I did, I don't remember what class I taught. I think it was a pyramid class or something. We were talking about plumbing tests. Plumbing tests are not high pressure. They fill up the line with water and they plug it off, and then they wait and they see if it leaks. You know, it's like filling up a plastic jug that has a crack in it, but you're not sure if that crack's all the way through or if it's just superficial. Okay, maybe it's a glass jug. Okay, so if it's all the way through, then that water is going to find its way to leak out of that glass jug. The same way with plumbing. A lot of times these are older homes. Sometimes they're homes that have had repair work done to the foundation maybe 5 years ago or so, and the buyer, just for their own peace of mind, want to make sure the plumbing's still holding, and so they want to do a plumbing test. So you just have to negotiate that. So good luck with that. Okay, this is a handy form that's rarely used. So sometimes as listing agents, we have to provide information to buyer's agents because we're required to on the seller's disclosure. Maybe it's a previous report that has been done, a previous inspection report, or a structural engineering report, something like that, or some other report, you know, that or some other type of assessment. You know, maybe the roof has been assessed or the foundation's been assessed or whatever. But you don't, I mean, this is not your information. You're just passing on the information. And the reason this has come up because it's been in case studies that a listing agent has passed on a structural engineering report that she obtained from the seller, just passed it on to the buyer's agent for their information. And then something happened, they took that information and moved forward with it. And then something happened and the buyer ended up suing the seller and the agent for what was on that report. Well, we're not responsible for what's on the report. We just took it from the seller and gave it to the buyer, right? So this form is to be used when you're doing such as that. Broker obtained the attached information identified as fill in the blank, structural engineering report dated such and such from, you know, XYZ Foundation or XYZ Engineering Company, whatever. Engineering report dated such and such from XYZ Engineering Company. Brokers relied on attached information and does not know or has no reason to know that the information is false or inaccurate, except if you know that something's on that report that's not right, then you need to say it out loud. That's a disclosure, right? But if you don't know, then put NA or none. Broker does not warrant or guarantee the accuracy of the information. Don't rely on the attached information without verifying its accuracy. Okay, it's kind of a CYA. All right, hold harmless, please, kind of thing. Got it? Okay, we do not want to do software right now. How do I make that go away? It won't let me click on it. Oh, that's annoying. No. No. How do I? Oh well. I can't. Maybe it'll go away. Escape.
Can you do it on your computer? Like you.
Oh. Just screwed myself. No, it won't let me. Okay, good. Okay, now I have to get all the way down to where I was before. That's awesome. Sorry, guys. A little unexpected. And this thing is not working very well. Okay. Okay. So, okay. So how do I blow this up now? Lovely. Addendum for reservation of oil, gas, and other minerals. I'm sorry, I can't blow it up. Christy, how do I do this? Would you go tell her that we're recording over here? Okay, I'm sorry, I can't blow it up. I don't know how to do that. Okay, I know I'm screen sharing, but I'm trying to blow this thing up.
Is it a plus? The plus sign?
Did you try Control Plus?
Oh, you're so smart. Who is that? Emmett. Takes somebody under 30 to do that, or 40 or whatever.
Well, it didn't work, so.
Control Plus, I didn't.
Plus.
Ta-da! You're so good. Okay. All right. Okay. This is, okay, so this happens most often when we're on listing appointments and the seller says, well, I want to keep my mineral rights.
Right.
I want to keep my mineral rights, right? So they're like, well, okay, that's fine. What makes you think you have your mineral rights? And so they either, if a seller has their mineral rights, either there's been a lease signed, there's been some kind of indication that they were contacted back when this Barnett Shale stuff is going on, and that somebody contacted them about signing a lease, that kind of stuff. So that would indicate that they do have their mineral rights. If nobody's contacted them ever, then likely they don't have their mineral rights. Okay. So, and then if they do have a lease that they signed back in, late 2000s or whatever, or mid 2000s when all that was going on, get them to go find it and get a copy of it, because you need to provide that to the buyer. That's one of those things that you can use that other form for. Okay, that I'm giving you this document. I don't know where it came from. I don't know if it's good, but here you go. But provide that lease to the buyer, just to substantiate the fact that the seller does own some part of their mineral rights, if not all of them. And this is stating that they're reserving all of the mineral rights owned by the seller, or they're reserving undivided percentage interest in the mineral estate. So, and take note, if the seller doesn't own all of the mineral estate, maybe he owns 50%, seller reserves only this percentage or fraction of the seller's interest. So if seller reserves an undivided 50% of the mineral estate, if he only owns 50%, then he's reserving 50% of the 50%. Okay? So he can't give away what he doesn't have.
Right.
Make sense? Okay. Or the seller is also, and he does not need to reserve or retain the implied rights of ingress and egress. So if you, as a listing or buyer's agent, gets this form, and this would be done by the listing agent, if C is checked, does reserve the rights, you change that, because the seller should not have the right, if your buyer buys the property, to say who can come and go on the property. Okay, so it needs to be checked on that. Does that make sense? Okay. If mineral rights don't come up, don't bring them up. Okay, you only use this if the seller wants to retain the rights. Now, there is no way that we do not have a resource to find out if the seller has mineral rights or not. It's nowhere that we have access to, and we're not they are literally called a landman, and they go to the county courthouse and they do the research, and they go back to, 100 years ago, 150 years ago, when the rights were, or hundreds of years ago, when the rights were given to the settlers. And if, they have to track back all the way back that far to see where the minerals were split off from the land itself. Okay, that's a landman. We don't do that. Okay, that's a specialty type thing. So there's no way for us to know. Either they know or they don't know, and that's all there is to it. Registration agreement between broker and owner. If you have a buyer that wants to see a for sale by owner, or maybe the buyer wants to buy their neighbor's property. It's not for sale, but they know that their neighbor's going to be buying at some point, and they really always love their house, and so they're going to buy their house and then sell theirs, or something like that, where there's not a listing agent involved. It's just the broker or just the owner. Then you need to use this form, and that's in the sale and the lease situation. If sometimes, and I've had agents say, a friend of mine, they don't want to actually list the property, but they want me to do the paperwork. I'm not going to represent them. That's the case. Okay. And down here, you identify the owner, you identify, Keller Williams DFW preferred, and yourself as the agent. Here's the property, a legal description, asking price. The owner is presently asking $250,000 to sell the property, or $1,500 to lease the property. And so what you're doing, you're registering the buyer, okay, the prospect or the tenant with the owner, and it begins on, and it can be short. I mean, you can contact a for sale by owner, say, I have this buyer that's really interested in your property. I would love to show it. Would you allow me to show it? I have a form for that. If you're agreeable to paying me, yes, I'd be glad to pay you. This is the form you use. Get them to sign it, send it to them, DocuSign, get them to sign it, and say, hey, why don't we do this for just 30 days, okay, or 2 weeks, or whatever it is. Because if my buyer likes it, he's gonna make an offer on it right away, okay? So the time frame, you gotta have a beginning and ending in order to have a contract, but the time frame can be kind of, it can be flexible. You don't have to make it a really long if the owner doesn't want to be tied up very long. But it's only with that one prospect. So if the owner agrees to sell all part of the property, owner will pay a broker fee equal to, what's he going to pay you in A? Okay, 3%, 2%, whatever. B, is it a flat fee for using dealing with the paperwork? My neighbor and I are going to do this deal. We just need for you to do the paperwork. It's still a commission, but they're going to pay you $1,500 or $1,000. I really discourage working for free because there's still liability involved.
Yes.
There's still liability, and there's no point in working for free. Just is not a good idea because of the liability involved. Besides that, it kind of sucks. So fees payable either during the term of the agreement or after its termination, at the closing of funding of sale, the owner's breach of this agreement, maybe he changes his mind, okay? Or he refuses to pay you. He signs this document and then he refuses to pay you, okay? Or the owner breaches the contract. Maybe he defaults on the contract. He decides that he doesn't want to sell to this prospect. You've done your job. He still owes you a fee. Good luck collecting it. So, in leases, same thing. Okay, percentage of rents, flat fee, in one payment. 5 days after move in or whatever that is. Renewals, it's really tough on renewals because likely if a tenant, if you represent a tenant in a lease, and that's if it's just a even if it's listed on the MLS, Generally the renewal is between the tenant and the landlord. An agent's not involved, okay? So an owner, really, I don't expect an owner to pay me, if a tenant just re-ups for another year or something, because I've done my job. Or subsequent sale. Now, if you've stayed engaged with that tenant, if you stay in relationship with that tenant, you should be the one bringing that tenant's offer to the landlord. If you find out about it after the fact, then that means you didn't know enough about what was going on in that tenant's life. Should you be paid? You know what I'm saying? So if you stay in contact with that tenant, hey, I'd really like to buy this house. It just fits my needs. Great. Let me represent you. I'll contact the homeowner and we'll get this ball rolling. Then you're involved in landlord landlord, homeowner, tenant wants to buy it. I will deal with all the paperwork. Are you willing to pay me? That kind of stuff. So then you do your negotiating.
Who is paying you if you return?
The prospect with the owner.
The owner.
Yeah, the owner will be paying you. Owner will pay broker at the closing of the sale. Okay. Representation. Who do you represent? You need to give the owner an IABS, of course. And then, are you representing the owner, the prospect? You can't. I don't even know how you act as an intermediary out with an owner and a prospect, because this is not a listing agreement. So I don't even think 3 is valid. But anyway, you know what I'm seeing? Okay. All right. And then, it's the entire agreement, disbursements, related parties, additional notices, blah, blah, blah. Okay. We've got some background noise. If you'll mute yourself, remember this is being recorded. And you know what? That is the last form. Woohoo! That's the last form, guys. Do you have any questions? I know we kind of charged through that pretty fast. If anything comes up, you can always call me if you have any questions that come up later, or if you start to use that form, and you want to, you have a question regarding that. So just let me know, okay? Any questions before we depart? I'm going to unmute you so you can talk. Anything?
Liz, you did a great job, and we appreciate your time.
Always. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. All right, you guys. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Liz.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Liz.
Thank you, Tara.